August 15, 2021 was when Kabul fell to the Taliban as they violently and forcibly took over.
We urge the Australian government to immediately grant Hazara refugees holding temporary status permanent protection.
Voices matter. Amplifying our voices, collective power actually builds pressure on the government, and they're listening, they're hearing us.
It's that grief that has brought us together. We're here in standing against the oppressive regime in Afghanistan and showing our solidarity for the people of Afghanistan, those who are the millions who are in Afghanistan right now, oppressed and suffering under the terrorist regime, and the millions others scattered across the world like us in diaspora.
Our government here in Australia, so-called Australia, was very much involved in the occupation and the intervention for 20 years. And we talk about a moral obligation to show up and to stand up, and not just in solidarity, but we need it to be an action. And it's been 12 months since Kabul was dropped, and we need to see that action now. We've had a new government in place for a few months. We've been calling for at least 20,000 humanitarian visas to be granted. That is nowhere near enough. We know a whole country of over 40 million people are facing a humanitarian crisis beyond comprehension at the moment. It's actually granting people permanent protection for those who are living their lives in limbo on TPVs, on SHIVs, who have no pathway to permanent protection. That also limits their ability to have family reunions. And we know how imperative family is to our communities, to the diaspora. That needs to be urgently addressed, as well as, you know, the Afghans that are languishing in Indonesia with no respite or timelines for resettlement. These are all part of our key calls for the action for Afghanistan. I urge everyone to go online, to follow, to amplify the voices of the people from Afghanistan. I really want to emphasize that is really important. Your voices matter. Amplifying our voices, collective power actually builds pressure on the government, and they're listening, they're hearing us, and they just need to really act on their promises before the election. And it's been months now, and we're waiting for a decision, and we can't stop until we get there and we get what we want.
Hazaras are targeted based on their ethnicity, their religion, and their dedication to democratic political institutions, liberal values, and human rights in Afghanistan. Hazaras are not a homogeneous group. We have Shia, Sunni, Ismaili, and atheist Hazaras, constituting roughly between 30 to 40% of Afghanistan's population. However, as one of the largest ethnic groups in the country, the Hazara people have endured a history of genocide, which have taken in the forms of oppression, slavery, torture, massacres, and forced displacement. At the hands of the Taliban and other extremists, Hazaras have been subjected to institutional discrimination, systemic and widespread atrocities. It's an experience that has earned the Hazaras the sad title of one of the most persecuted people in the world. The genocide of the Hazaras is not new. It began in 1890s when Pashtun ruler Abdurrahman waged a brutal war against the Hazara people, which resulted in bloody massacres and the distribution of Hazara lands to Pashtun tribes. Hazaras lost some 60% of its population during this period. Over the following decades, Hazaras continued to face repression, discrimination, and socio-economic marginalization. Many were forced to conceal their identities to obtain state identification. During the Taliban regime of the late 1990s, the mantra of the Taliban was Tajiks to Tajikistan, Uzbeks to Uzbekistan, and Hazaras to Goristan. Goristan is the Pashto word for graveyard. In August of 1998, one of the worst atrocities was committed by the Taliban against the Hazara people in Mazar-e-Sharif, when in a matter of few days, more than 8,000 Hazaras were massacred. Hazaras faced collective persecution throughout the period of late 1990s and early 2000s under the Taliban regime. Sadly, persecution of the Hazaras by ISKP and the Taliban continues today. Since 2015, some 2,000 Hazaras have been murdered by the Taliban and ISKP terrorists, who have targeted schools, maternity centers, wedding halls, hospitals, and mosques. These attacks are carried out with the genocidal intent to destroy the Hazara ethnic and religious group in Afghanistan, in whole or in part. And their intention remains very clear: to eliminate the Hazara people from Afghanistan. The US Holocaust Museum, Genocide Watch, and other organizations monitoring Afghanistan have issued genocide emergency alerts warning of continuing genocide against the Hazara people. Australia is home to some 42,000 people from the Hazara ethnicity, many of whom fled the Taliban during the previous regime in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I, for example, is a product of that time. Australian Hazaras are renowned for being highly entrepreneurial and have created successful businesses, particularly in resettlement hubs such as Dandenong, Shepparton, and Naracoorte. Having been treated as second-class citizens in Afghanistan, once given the opportunity to settle in Australia, Hazaras have seized every opportunity to build their lives and contribute to Australia's society. Our calls to action are: firstly, we urge the Australian government to immediately grant Hazara refugees holding temporary status permanent protection, so they can settle here and be reunited with their families. 2, we call on our government to lift the ban on resettlement from Indonesia, which prevents refugees who are registered with the UN Refugee Agency to get resettlement to Australia, and therefore should allow Hazara refugees to be resettled in Australia through the UNHCR program. 3, marginalized groups such as the Hazaras are unable to access aid due to discrimination by Taliban authorities in Afghanistan. As such, as Australia delivers aid in Afghanistan, we urge the Australian government to pressurize the Taliban through aid leverage, and to work alongside NGOs in the country to employ local Hazara staff to ensure that marginalized communities like the Hazara people can access aid and other essential services. 4, we call on the UN Security Council to appoint an independent investigative team to thoroughly investigate, document, and report on the ongoing persecution and genocide of the Hazara people. 5th, We call on the Australian and international media to clearly identify and mention the identity of the victims of each attacks that happen in the country as Hazaras in their reportings. Too often, the specific genocidal nature of the attacks is overlooked in media reportings, as it fails to mention the specific identity of the victim. In refraining from using the word Hazara in their headlines, the media overlooks the central fact that Hazaras, as victims of these attacks, are systemically targeted based on their ethnic and religious identity. 6. To protect the Hazaras, the international community, including Australia, must pressure the Taliban through aid distribution and other channels to protect the rights of the Hazara people and to prevent their genocide. We must honor the promise of never again under the Genocide Convention.